to In the Reads, the official podcast of San Jose State University's Read Magazine, California's oldest literary journal. I'm Peggy Pollard, Chief Podcast Editor. This episode, I'm interviewing author Amelia K Saint, the winner of the Nonfiction contest for our Read Magazine, issue 157, the Gabriele Rico Challenge for Nonfiction. Her short story, Breaking Kayfabe, tells of a family traumatized by witnessing two vehicle accidents, one life-threatening car accident, another a deadly motorcycle crash, and parallels this with stories of trauma inside the world of televised big-time pro wrestling. The story deals with matters of witnessing, memory, truth, and trauma. Amelia Skinner Saint is an English and writing instructor at Briarcliff University in Sioux City, Iowa. Saint's creative writing has won the Lorien Hemingway Short Story Award, the H.E. Francis Award for Fiction. In addition to teaching, she helps curate a live storytelling series and serves as the art editor for the horror literary magazine, Broken Antler. She'll earn her PhD in 2025 and has an MA in creative writing, both at the University of South Dakota. Amelia, welcome to In the Reads podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Peggy. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to read a passage from very close to the beginning, and this deals with a bit of the wrestling element of the story and also touches on some of the witnessed trauma, the personal aspect of the story as well. So here we go. On May 23rd, 1999, in an arena filled with over 16,000 people, a man in a blue mask and cape fell 78 feet from the ceiling, bounced off the top rope, and landed on his back in the wrestling ring. His aorta was severed, probably when his upper chest impacted the top rope near the turnbuckle. Owen Hart, wrestling as the Blue Blazer, was dead within moments. When Hart fell, most of the 16,000 people were turned away from the ring, watching a pre-recorded promo on the big screen. There was a crash, a cloud of dust. Then there was a man lying in the ring, and no one knew where he had come from. In wrestling, everything is either kayfabe or shoot. Kayfabe, thought to be a kind of pig Latin for fake, refers to anything done in character to further the storyline. A shoot is when a wrestler breaks character and drops the act, or when they suffer a real injury in the ring. Within minutes, Hart's body was taken from the ring, and the show went on. The audience in the Kansas City arena could not be sure whether the fall was kayfabe or a shoot until after they went home that night and Owen Hart's death was reported on the 10 o'clock news. My daughter saw the moment of impact when the SUV hit the little girl. Then, my hand covered her eyes, and she didn't see her again. The boxy black SUV stopped nose to tail with mine. The girl landed about 10 feet further on. When her body stopped bouncing, she jumped up and kept running, like her body didn't realize that it had ever stopped running. I was already out of my car on my way to her. Her eyes were wild and something about her body looked wrong. I approached her as I would a spooked horse, arms wide, voice making soothing noises. I think I told her she needed to sit down. I didn't want to touch her. I might have been afraid of hurting her, or I might have just been afraid of feeling how badly she was hurt. And I'll stop there.
This is pretty stunning opening to your stories, to dealing with these two horrible traumas. And seems to me that the theme of what you're writing about is not so much someone going through the trauma as people witnessing the traumas. Dig through the layers of that, because and you opened the story so beautifully with that car accident that really slowed everything down into, microseconds, and wonderfully described that feeling of the shock of as you're witnessing something. Why did you decide to write on that theme? Was there something particular that provoked you to write on?
I'm an external processor, I think is what it's called. I process trauma, events, emotions by usually talking through them or if I don't have anyone that I can talk at about something, I have to write about it. And that's probably one of the reasons that I became a writer. Just because it's something that I am compelled to do in certain instances, like after witnessing this pedestrian car accident with my daughter. It was, you know, it was a traumatic thing to witness. And in that witnessing, it kind of brought up other traumatic witnessing that I connected on a subconscious level initially, and then only through the writing could I connect them in a more conscious way and understand what it was that was kind of sticking with me about this. It was the witnessing of the trauma, someone's world literally ending in a moment
Mm.
while the rest of the world goes on. And the incredible feeling of disbelief that the world is going on around such a tragedy, um, and trying to understand how that is possible and how, whenever you are adjacent to or part of a tragic event, how you can get your world to begin moving again.
Mm. Yeah. So going through this experience yourself with your daughter, seeing this other young girl running in the street, and it sounds like you captured so well the feeling of everything, like the microseconds blowing up and every
Mhm.
part of it being so vivid. As that's our human um, tendency, is when there's something traumatic, something very emotional, the memories stick so deep in us and sometimes take years or a lifetime to what I appreciated about the way you described that was the surrealness of it, of being able to experience that as a mother. There's so many things in this event and the other two big events that you talk about in the story where you're not even sure what happened. You're not sure. You said that you covered your daughter's eyes, but you didn't realize you were doing that till later. And there is
Mhm.
some things about the trauma are so vivid, but then other things you don't even realize what you were doing at the moment. Was that hard to
Yeah,
write about for you?
it felt very important to write about because the memory in the moment was so vivid.
Mm,
Um, and the experience of the moment, it felt very much like the way I wrote it. Like it was outsized. The moment was huge. And even though it was just a few seconds, everything slowed down and, suddenly in my immediate memory, I was aware of everything around us. And I didn't want to lose that. I wanted to write it down and I wanted to capture it before, it just became, it became covered in layers of, other memories and in narrativizing the trauma, which of course this writing about it is the ultimate way of narrativizing a trauma.
yeah.
But I wanted to try and capture how I actually experienced it and how my daughter experienced it.
Mm,
And she actually, when I covered her eyes, it was an instinct. I saw that a girl was about to be hit by a car, and
mm,
I didn't want my daughter to see that. But because of the moment when I covered her eyes, she, in her imagination of the event, made it much worse than it actually was.
mm.
Um, because I had, taken away that visual input, she was left to imagine the worst. And of course, that's exactly what she did.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So actually trying to protect her from it, you feel that it actually made it worse in some way.
I think it did. And, of course, you never know if you had it to do over again, what I would do. I didn't intend to cover her eyes even in the moment. It wasn't a thought. It was just something that I did. But I realize now it makes sense that, after we were talking together about the event later, she said that she saw the moment right before impact. And when I covered her eyes, her brain filled in the rest.
Ah,
And you know how brains are. They're awful. They're just awful things to walk around with. And so her brain invented a very gruesome outcome to the story that I interrupted by covering her eyes.
Wow. Wow, that's interesting. All right, so this is tangential to your work with horror fiction, and which is not my genre at all. I was probably like, oh, you're an art curator for the Broken Antler horror magazine. So apparently you like that genre. And how did that play into how you wrote this story?
This story came about before a group of my colleagues and I started Broken Antler, and I was brought on as the art curator. So this story predates that. The reason that I was asked to be art curator was because I appreciate the horror aesthetic. I mean, I kind of am a big horror lover. I love the campy 80s gore. I love, you know, monster movies. I love all of the horror that you would not classify as art. But I think that horror can inform a lot of amazing literature and art just because it gives us a space to play with unreality, and it creates a world in which, you know, anything can be a monster. And to frame something that is commonplace, something everyday, as monstrous can, I think, really help us to understand it in a new way.
One of your interviews, you talked about the kind of monster you would want to be, either the trash heap from Fraggle Rock or Jeff Goldblum's character in The Fly. Tell me about monsters and what you see as the role of a monster in a narrative story, in a fiction story, or even in this story.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the trash heap from Fraggle Rock because she is very dear to me still. And I think that's because she's not really a monster. She's monstrous. Yes, she's a living and speaking pile of garbage. Um, and you know, certain of the certain people in the world of Fraggle Rock are afraid of her, but she is really a benevolent monster who only wants to offer help and advice and wisdom. um you know, I think being an older woman uh is probably not the most flattering way to think of myself, as someone who's accumulated a big pile of trash in my years on this earth, and I'm ready to turn that trash into wisdom for people. But
I like
um
that metaphor, being of the older vibe myself. Yeah.
yeah,
The
you got to
wisdom.
turn your trash into wisdom.
So in that character, something that appears to be scary to little kids, they just see it as something negative. There's actually a lot of positivity in it. And is that so? Maybe the role of a monster in a story, the stories I do like is when there's a terrible monster, but it turns out to have a positive side. There's some positive result that it brings in the story.
Yeah, I think there, you know, that's definitely a trope that's present in a lot of horror material and culture, is that misunderstood monster who, like Frankenstein's monster, is assumed to be evil and harmful, but in actuality, they are just they're in a monstrous body, or they are perceived in a way that is monstrous but is not accurate. So it really helps us to interrogate our assumptions, the way that we present and represent ourselves and others in the world. And you know, you have to really wonder what makes a monster. Oftentimes it's just the context or the world that they're trying to get along in.
Things that seem scary that we're afraid of, to face them and deal with them. Dealing with the accident you actually went through, and you felt like the best way for you to reconcile it was to write about it, to face the monster. And sounds like that it helped you to work it through, to not have it have such power over you.
I think I write somewhere in this piece about the feeling that my daughter and I had that any moment could be the moment right before another accident or another tragedy. Because you know, accidents like these, they're sudden, they wouldn't happen if they weren't unexpected. And so just getting out of that mindset of constantly being so vigilant and ready for something awful to happen, it was something that we needed to do, and we needed to do it, in a healthy way so that we could go about our lives without constantly expecting the worst.
So this connects with the whole idea of PTSD. I've heard people tend to be hyper vigilant. Every little thing sets them off because their body is in the state of reacting to the trauma they experienced over and over again in an unhealthy way.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, I think that's an excellent connection, and it's definitely something that I was aware of, especially for my daughter who has, she's young and she's lived a relatively sheltered life. And knowing that, I was very aware that witnessing an accident like this could and would be quite traumatic for her. So it was really important for me to process alongside her and to share my thoughts and my insights as I went through the writing process, and to bring her into the writing process and to read parts to her and say, is this right? Do you remember anything different? And being brought into the process like that allowed her to um, not just narrativize the trauma, which is a way of kind of rendering a trauma safe by turning it into a story, but also to look at it as a more logical process rather than an emotional experience. And for her, for the way my daughter's brain works, that was exactly what she needed.
interesting. So you feel the trauma of you and your daughter going through this prompted the story, and to be able to, you said, to not just turn into a narrative. Tell me about that process of how that helped you work it through with your daughter.
Yeah, well, I use the word narrativizing. I don't know if that's even a real word, but it sounds
It is.
like enough of a word for me to keep using it.
Just,
No, it's just the idea that if you have this big, scary event, if you can turn it into a story, turn it into words on a page, or even just spoken words, that makes it something manageable and something that is easier to fathom. And once you can fully fathom something, then you can put it away. You can put it in its place and not allow it to overcome you or overwhelm you.
very interesting. And this says to me that perhaps one of the reasons we replay these moments, these, terrible moments in our life, is we're trying to deal with it. We haven't finished dealing with it, figuring it out, understanding it in a way that makes sense to us. To work it through into a story, narrativizing it, your mind is making sense of it in a way to feel finished with that story, with that moment.
Yes. And I think, that's why I was so drawn in this narrative to the idea of Owen Hart, the accident that caused him to lose his life at a televised wrestling event, at a live event, because that that event was incredibly traumatic for a lot of people, but largely so. I mean, I think it was probably far more traumatic than it could have been because people truly did not understand what was happening. Because of the context of pro wrestling, when you expect everything to be play acting, you expect everything to be fake and drama, then someone falls in the ring and they die in front of you and everyone keeps going, just like how that moment that my daughter and I witnessed was made so unreal by the fact that everyone else was going on with their lives unaware that they were inside a tragedy. And so when the Owen Hart accident happened, um, all of the people witnessing it didn't know They didn't know that they'd seen a man die. They didn't know that it was real. They thought it was just part of the show. And the fact that the show went on, kind of doubled down on the unreality of the whole situation.
Mhm. Yeah, and so there's a parallel with you instinctively putting your hand over your daughter's eyes, and the TV hosts, they were stunned. It was the culture of big time wrestling to just keep going when there was real injuries, and both the instinctive human, let's just keep going because we don't know how to handle this, and also they didn't want to lose money from canceling the show or interrupting, having to refund money.
Exactly. It was a pay-per-view broadcast, that's a big moneymaker, and they would have had to give refunds if they had stopped the show. And oddly, the pay-per-view broadcast, they acknowledged that Owen had died on the broadcast. However, to the live audience, no one said anything. They only found out after they left what had actually happened. And even then, so many people didn't believe it. They thought that he would come back the next week because this was a thing in pro wrestling, that people would die, quote unquote, but then they would come back. And so seeing a wrestler being taken out of the ring on a stretcher, being driven away in an ambulance, that could have been part of the show for all they knew.
That the setup in their culture was that was normal,
Hmm.
right? Part of the performance, and even how the wrestlers themselves handled it too. They kept on with the show, and in the story, I think there was a couple of stories. The one where Brian Hart died,
Hmm.
all of a sudden falling out of the blue and sort of stunned everybody. But there was also the one previous to that where the wrestler was injured accidentally, and he said, "Don't carry me out on a stretcher." That he did not want to be known he was actually injured, so they faked him winning that bout.
It's, they pro wrestlers have very strict scripts and rules that they have to follow. They have to make certain moves to put, certain wrestlers in a position to win or lose. And if they were to break that script, then it would throw everything out. The whole season would have to be rewritten. So a
Wow.
lot of work is riding on a guy, Steve Austin. I think the incident that you're talking about is Steve Austin, who broke his
Oh.
neck in the ring with Owen Hart. And even with the broken neck, he knew, like, no, I'm gonna finish this somehow,
Hmm.
because a lot was riding on it, which is just, absolutely wild to think of, for a college professor. Yeah, if I stub my toe too hard, I'm gonna leave.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go home. But
he broke his neck, and they still arranged it in the moment within a few seconds that he was sort of limped up, and then the guy had him arrange it so he was falling on the guy with the
yeah.
broken neck was falling on top of him so that he could be the winner of the bout and he could barely hold up his prize. Oh, that's just
Yeah, it was, and that's a match that, you can still see, you can find it online and see he's clearly terribly injured. He can barely move, but he's not gonna break kayfabe, and he keeps going.
how did you know about these wrestling stories? How did you get into that?
I'm a child of the 80s, and I think we all kind of grew up on pro wrestling. It was definitely, I was young at a time when the TV was the center of everyone's home, and every night you sit in front of the TV and you watch what's on. So we watched pro wrestling. And as I got older, I kind of thought I came to see it as a very silly thing that, oh, why are we watching this soap opera of shirtless men, roughing each other up? But then as I got even older, I came back around and realized what an amazing art it is.
Mm.
That, it is a story, it is storytelling, it is performance, it's athleticism, and it is also so very camp. You know, I don't think in the 80s I would have known the word camp and recognized that as what wrestling was, and that as being one of the most appealing things about it. But
Mm.
yeah, I mean, it's really got everything when you think about it. It's got outfits, it's got hair, it's got attitude.
Outsized characters. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically Drag Race, you know, for like straight white guys from Mississippi. And that's my little way of ruining wrestling for straight white guys from Mississippi.
I mean, I grew up with it being on TV. I know a lot of the names, Hulk Hogan and
There's something too that you could you could compare to horror, especially, you know, the gore, the very violent horror, in that it is so over the top that we never for a second mistake it for being real. And there is some comfort in that. There's some comfort in entering a world where you know it's performance because it's just such, you know, such big things are happening. Which is why, you know, when it does begin to be real, when it becomes real, like with Owen Hart, or Stone Cold Steve Austin, it's hard to understand what's happening. And there is an extra layer of disbelief beyond just the trauma of witnessing an injury or a death.
mm. In what ways would you say that it average reader, why do they enjoy these stories and how does that help them feel better about their lives?
And there's a level of catharsis involved in reading trauma or horror, things things where bad things happen to people. Because, you know, if we're right down to it, we live in a world where bad things might happen to anyone, anytime. We live in a pretty unstable world and an unstable moment in history. And we want to know that there is a resolution. So putting something in the form of a story or a film or even a wrestling match where, yes, it's awful, it's gory, it's terrible, but at the end, it's over. I feel like there really is a comfort in knowing that there could be an end somehow. There could be some kind of satisfying results to the most unimaginable horrors.
Hmm. Very interesting. In the ring, the bell rings and there's a physical end to it. And
Mm.
and in so many ways it's such a physical thing. Their bare hands and their physical strength, man on man or woman on woman. And
Mhm.
yeah, there's something very primal about that competition. You're wrestling with the other, and maybe there's the good guy and the bad guy, which they hype up. Uh,
Yeah,
then there's a bell. There's a referee and there's a bell and there's structure to it. It's within
exactly.
the ring. It's within this cage, and yeah.
You
So
know, you're taking the most primitive type of conflict, you know, two people physically fighting each other, and you add layers upon layers of rules, regulations, social constructs, scripts, lights, costumes, storylines, backstories. You add all of that on as a way to kind of I don't know, I don't want to say civilize this kind of brutal and primitive conflict, but it makes it into a story and it makes it fun.
mm,
And, you know, kind of like what I was saying about narrativizing a traumatic event, turning something into a story makes it manageable. It's something that we can understand more fully.
mm, yeah. Especially if you know it's not true, well, at least most of the
Yeah.
time, then you want to root for yay, good guy, bad guy, and yeah.
Yeah, it's safe. It's a safe way to kind of indulge in what is probably like a biological desire to witness violence and witness brutality.
Well, life is full of conflict and violence, and it used to be against the saber-toothed tiger. Now it's against somebody in the office or yeah, it's different formats, but there's still a lot of conflict to daily life. And maybe it's me versus the traffic.
You know, the difference is though, when you know, when your big conflict is with traffic, you don't get that cathartic release like you would if you were running away from a saber-toothed tiger. And so you come home after your very unsatisfying traffic conflict with no resolution, and you maybe want some catharsis. Maybe you want to watch two men in costumes throw each other around a ring until somebody rings a bell. It's a way of kind of satisfying that need for resolving that conflict that, is constantly going on around us and inside us.
There's a winner and a loser. There's a resolution.
Mm-hmm.
I love the way that you wrote about it so journalistically, matter-of-factly. It helped us experience what it was like. How much did you watch big time wrestling yourself? Did you watch it a lot before you wrote the story, or did you?
I did. Like I said, I got into it when I was young, and then it kind of fell out of fashion when I was a teenager, just like literally everything else that I liked. It wasn't cool anymore. But then I had kids, and they started getting into wrestling. And so of course my husband and I, we're about the same age. We had to tell them all the lore of of the 80s wrestlers and the 90s wrestlers, and all of the things that happened. So kind of taking our kids down that path and sharing this thing with them, this cultural product that we had enjoyed so much with our kids. It refreshed that for me. And so that's why, when this car accident happened, uh, the idea of connecting it to Owen Hart's death was pretty close by because, we were taking our kids to SummerSlam that year. So it's something that was definitely within our cultural zeitgeist as a family.
In the story, you have three stories going on. Two of them are the same family, you and your daughter, and then also the grandmother,
That was my mother.
your mother, who witnessed two people on motorcycles being killed by another car. Why did you choose those three stories? Did they?
Reaching out to my mom after my daughter and I had witnessed this accident, it felt like something that was very natural because I knew it had just been a couple of years prior that she had witnessed a very, very traumatic accident. And she had had a pretty traumatic response to that event. Um, and what I wanted, I think what anybody wants, I'm in my 40s, I still want to be able to call my mom and ask her, to make something okay. Um, and of course that's not how any of this works, but that impulse was still present that I wanted to talk to my mom. I wanted my mom to tell me that soon I would forget about it and I wouldn't think about it anymore and I would move on. Um, that's not true and that's not what she told me, but it was very helpful to be able to connect with her about that and to, I think a lot of people are, especially people my age, are struggling maybe to find ways to connect with their parents. So, being able to ask her for help, even though it wasn't a situation that she could help with, was a good experience for both of us. And it did, give us a point of connection at a time when we don't have that many points of connection anymore. But yeah, just kind of going through having her narrate that experience to me again, talking through it, I think it was helpful for both of us. And so it felt very natural for that to be part of the story, that not just what she witnessed, but the act of me reaching out to her.
As you continued the story with these three braids of narratives, your mother ended up burying
Two dogs,
two
yes.
dogs. What?
That was one of the things I really wanted to explore with her when I talked to her about the accident we had witnessed and the accident she had witnessed. She immediately after the accident went home and had two of her dogs put to sleep. And I, at the time, of course, thought, okay, mom, you need to really think through some things, because something about witnessing that accident, I think, had made her feel the need to be very decisive about life and death.
Mm.
And it had brought death into very close contact with her. And so she wound up being, in a situation where she felt like, okay, this is something I can control. This, of course, isn't how she articulated it to me, but I think it is very natural to be desperate for some sense of control after witnessing the most out of control event and moment that you can imagine. Do I think, I mean, her dogs were, to be clear, very old. They were very sick. They probably needed to be put to sleep anyway. But the fact that she felt like she had to do it that day, I think speaks more to her state of mind about life and death and control.
In the scene where these two people were on the motorcycle and a car just slams into them, kills them instantly, as out in her mind, out of nowhere appears people who covered them with white sheets. That's such a peaceful image of a way to honor a death and to deal with it in a ceremonial kind of way. And
Yes, and I remember her telling me that and thinking it was so surreal, thinking, that doesn't happen in real life when people really die on the highway. Well, later I found out, I did just a little research and found out that the white sheets were actually tablecloths from the pizza restaurant across the road. And, um, the owners of the restaurant had come out and put tablecloths over the bodies, which, I mean, it was just such a lovely and beautiful thing to do in this terrible, terrible moment.
the humanity, just to have respect for, this grisly scene, just to put a peaceful end to that moment. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then for her to carry it forward, as you were saying, to feel like there's something that she could do to with her own pets, to have them put to sleep, and had a burial ceremony for them.
Mhm. Yeah, she is the family pet cemetery caretaker, because, she lives on a farm out in the country in North Alabama. That's where I'm from. And, she loves planning the pet cemetery, which, again, that was another one of my favorite horror movies as a child, was Stephen King's Pet Cemetery. So I've always really enjoyed going out there as well, and, pretending like the dogs and cats are gonna come back to life as little zombies. But,
Ah.
um, but yeah, so far that hasn't happened, luckily. But,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to have a realistic and positive attitude toward death.
Mm,
And for my mom, I know that taking care of those, the needs of the body after death is
mm.
something that's very important to her, and something that she can do and enjoys doing. So, I think that probably gave her a lot of comfort, being able to take care of her pets in that way.
A proper burial shows great respect for the life. This was a life, it's ended, and now I'm honoring that life by doing something in a ceremonial, a peaceful way, right?
Yes, exactly.
So our culture, we tend to separate death, and we oh no, that's the worst thing, but it's a part of every life. And so to deal with it, it gives us peace with our life, that our lives will each have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and to know that that's all okay. Yeah.
Yes.
And
And after the end, then, the love and the care, continues, just changes forms. It can be beautiful, just as much as loving a living person or a living thing can be.
now I'm getting the glimpse that the horror genre, dealing with the worst sides of life, the worst monsters in life, whether they're a trash heap or they're really awful monsters, which pretty much every story has something. That's what makes a story. To be able to deal with that and have that be part of life, then it takes away the power of it in regular life, to know that we can deal with that. And I think that's the
Yeah.
value of your story, is dealing with these three traumas, how real people dealt with them in real ways. And it's really a beautiful story of that.
Well, thank you.
So, and I'm just starting to get the sense of how the horror genre that helps you as a writer to write about these so well.
Yes, I think that, I mean, I feel very much like, like a sponge, whenever I try to conceptualize my writing, and what comes out depends on what kind of water I'm soaking in. If I am surrounded by horror, or true crime documentaries, that's another one of my, I don't want to say guilty pleasures, but somewhat hard to explain pleasures, that I enjoy. That is going to inform no matter what I'm writing about. If I'm writing about the loveliest little story about an old man and an old woman who, get married and love each other for the rest of their lives, there are going to be little elements of horror that seep in at the edges. And that's just because of that is the culture, that's the bucket that I'm soaking in.
Mm. And that gives it the edge of reality in it. It makes it, if it's too nice, it's boring, we fall asleep. But if it's got some spark edge, we feel like, ooh, there's something I can learn here from that.
Mhm.
That helps me deal with my real life. Would you call Breaking Kayfabe a horror story?
I think that's a really interesting question. Certainly, horrifying things happen, on every page of the story. There is a little girl who is struck by an SUV. There are two people who are killed, in an auto motorcycle accident. There's a man who falls into a wrestling ring and dies. It's just death after death, tragedy after tragedy. But I don't think I would call it horror, because I think it is not quite simple enough. We've talked a little bit already about how the horror stories simplify tragedy and they simplify death and destruction in a way that lets the watcher or the reader assign blame and understand completely who is the bad guy and who is the victim.
Mm.
And in these stories, there is no bad guy. There are victims everywhere, but there is no villain or monster that we can identify. And I think without that monster, um, I don't think I would call it horror.
Mm. Interesting. And the blame part of it, and our rational mind wants to have reasons and cause and effect. In one of your bio descriptions, that your interests include comics, sci-fi, trashy thrillers, and absurd humor. And your aesthetic vibe is best described as dark whimsy, preferably featuring animals or monsters. So any
Yeah.
that.
I think that might be from my broken antler kind of aesthetic statement.
Mm.
Um, and it's true. I I like darkness, but I'm a very silly person. I am rarely serious. I have been serious for almost an hour now, and I'm like literally itching, because I haven't said anything silly or absurd for so long,
Oh
and
no.
it might be a record.
Oh, we
Um,
gotta solve that problem. Yeah.
I've always felt like at the core of my nature are these uh two things in tension, and one is darkness, horror, and death, and the other one is me just doing silly voices for my kids. So I mean, someday I'm gonna get there. Someday I'm gonna write the story that perfectly balances and captures those two sides of my nature. But I don't think I've done it yet.
Interesting. Okay. Is there a difference between horror and tragedy?
Yes.
What's the difference? I'm trying to find out. I'm desperate to find out. Please help me.
Yeah, I think I mean it's so difficult, to kind of try and define these two genres, but I feel like oftentimes in a tragedy there is there's no answer. There's no answer to a tragedy. There's no explanation to a tragedy. It's just pure loss and grief. Whereas horror, I don't think we often get to the grief in horror. We stop at the destruction and we kind of center the destruction in horror and we focus on that. And then the reader or the audience is left on their own to process the destruction and to kind of make sense of it, grieve or not grieve.
Hmm. Interesting. So then, is horror traumatizing the viewer? That's
I
my
think
question.
it definitely traumatizes some viewers.
Traumatizes
When
me. That's
yeah. When my sister and I were maybe 4 and 6 years old, we watched The Exorcist on TV, which was a bad idea. But again, it was the 80s and whatever came on the TV, went right into our eyeballs.
Mm.
So, it I loved it. I thought it was hilarious. But when her skin turns green and she throws up on the priest, that was the best. That was just the best thing I'd ever seen. My sister's a very different person. She's very sensitive. She's always been very anxious, and she was traumatized by Linda Blair when her head spins around backwards to the point where, she couldn't sleep. She was having nightmares.
That would
Whereas
be
I
me.
I yes. Well, you're gonna learn a little more about me when I tell you that after that, I would turn all of her dolls' heads around backwards.
Oh,
And
what a sister.
well, the younger sister, they're always kind of a shit. So yeah, I think that that's a good illustration of how horror affects people differently. I thought that it was the funniest thing that I'd ever seen when, this girl is her body is behaving in these grotesque ways.
Mm.
And it is still my sister is still bothered to this day when I go to her house and turn her dolls' heads around backwards because I do still do that.
Wow. That's a good sister relation. What does this piece represent for you in your development as a writer and an artist? The Breaking Kayfabe.
Yeah, that's an excellent question because this is really one of my first pieces of nonfiction, of personal nonfiction that I have published. So this was a big leap for me from publishing primarily fiction. I do a lot of comics as well, but to get so personal, and of course it's not that personal because I do bring a wrestler in, but it's about as personal as I'm gonna get. It was a big risk. It felt like a big risk for me. And so I was absolutely thrilled when I found success with it and, got into the magazine, won the Gabriele Rico award. So it was a really amazing kind of reassurance that the risk was worth it.
Because it was your personal story with your daughter, that's how you could describe it so well. You felt so real and so well written, cleanly and visually, and with the pacing of it all. So I'm glad that we could help with that. I want to ask, so now that you are extremely world famous from being a Read magazine winner, how has the celebrity status changed your life?
Well, I did treat all of my workshop friends to dinner. It's such an honor to have that affirmation. I feel like as writers, we are laboring in dark little vacuums so much of our time, and we don't get feedback, especially when you're beyond school, you're beyond writing workshops, and you just have to kind of do your work and send it out and see what happens. And sometimes you never know if a piece is worth it or not. If you're wasting your time, have you wasted your life? Have you made all the wrong decisions? And
Probably yes.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I can't say I've made all the right decisions, but getting some kind of confirmation that, okay, what I am doing has some value to some people is incredibly important and very rewarding.
Yeah. Amongst our editorial staff, we're sending you good feedback.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. No, my daughter likes it. That's the small handful of people who have read it outside of your editorial room. The feedback has been overall positive.
What else are you working on now?
Well, right now, I am finishing up my PhD and working on a creative dissertation. So that's basically where all of my juice is going. If I get in a mood or have some free time to sit around and scroll through Submittable, then maybe I'll get some more short pieces out there. But yeah, for the next year and a half, I'm gonna be in dissertation jail, and I can't look at or talk to or think about anything other than my dissertation.
I'll try to send you little gifts through how you can break out of prison. The key to breaking out is to finish it and then
Yeah, the only way out is through.
yeah. What is it that you want the audience to gain from your story? What
I think this particular piece is really all about putting words to an experience that we may not necessarily have words for. It's one of those pieces that anytime I've tried to describe it to someone, if someone asks me what it's about, I sound just like an idiot because I'm like, well, it's about a wrestler and also a car accident and then a motorcycle accident and some dogs get put to sleep. And at one point, I cut my mom's hair. It doesn't make any sense when I try to describe what happens because it is about an emotional reality and an emotional response to something that is very hard to understand and very hard to put into words in a sort of straight on way. So it's very much an oblique approach to tragedy and witnessing. And I hope my hope was to capture that discomfort of witnessing and the discomfort of not knowing, and the feeling of being in that place when you don't know what has happened. Are they alive? Are they dead? Is this real? Is this fake? Um, and the hope, I guess, is to connect with people who've had similar experiences and to kind of allow them a space to recognize that experience and to understand it in a more deep way.
Hmm. Well, I think you've done that very well, excellently, which is why you rightfully earned the Gabriele Rico Prize for nonfiction. And I think there's a lot of people who would feel you can understand that part of the reality of our life's experience. We all experience that to some extent. So thank you so much for your story, for your work, for your time being with us today. And I have learned so much from you already about the horror genre that I have been avoiding most of my life. So yes, thank you for the time and all that you've shared with us today.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
You can find more about Amelia Saint's work on Instagram at Skinner or Saint, Skinner or Saint, Saint, and email her at Amelia K Saint at yahoo.com. You can also see her work as art curator for Broken Antler magazine, www.brokenantlermag.com, and read her Rico Nonfiction Contest winning story, Breaking Kayfabe, in issue 157 of Read Magazine, www.readmag.org. Thank you to our guest, Amelia Saint. You've been listening to In the Reads, the podcast of San Jose State University's Read Magazine, California's oldest literary journal. Thanks for listening.